We're looking at a parable this morning from the Bible that begins with the words, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And when Jesus told these stories, these parables, and he begins with "the kingdom of heaven is like," it tells us that we're going to learn something about what God is like. We're going to learn something about what it's like to relate to the maker and creator of the universe. That's worth listening to, isn't it? In order for us to get our heads around this particular parable, it's worth understanding a practice, a work practice that existed at the time of Jesus. Now, it existed at the time of Jesus, but it also existed in Ireland, at least up until late in the last century, I think, and still exists in places around the world, including in Jerusalem, as far as I know. And it was this, that there was a spot in towns and cities where people could go, and it was often men who were going to labor for the day. And you could go to that spot, and people who needed to hire workers in a casual way for the day would come and pick some of those men to come and work on their farms or whatever work there was to do. So, for example, at the moment in Doha in Qatar, they're building lots of stadiums for the World Cup in 2022. And at the moment, there are spots in the city where people who come who are casual workers can go and they can be picked up in this way in order to get some work for the day. Now, it's not hard to imagine, even if you haven't ever done this or had to do it, to get your head around or to think your way into the difficulty of what it might be like to have to get work in this way, the indignity that goes with it, the dehumanizing effect of this kind of hiring practice for those who needed work. You might be able to picture somebody, a man, who gets up really early in the morning, kisses his wife while she's still sleeping and his kids as well, and heads out to this corner, hoping that he's going to be picked for some work, hoping that he's going to have the dignity and the humanity of being able to work on that particular day. Questions that he might be asking: will there be any work today? Even if there is work today, am I going to be picked for it? Will I be able to support my family? Will I be able to go home and say to my wife and to my kids, I was able to earn today? In this parable, in verses 1 to 5 in Matthew chapter 20, it describes this landowner who gets up early and he goes, likely 6 a.m. in the morning, to hire a group of workers. And he repeats this 3 times in the day. He hires at 3-hour intervals. He does this. And then we hear of a fifth time of him going at 5 p.m. And verse 8 is the kind of key verse that helps us understand the drama and the surprise behind this. When Jesus told these parables, there was always something that he would say that would cause the listening crowd to go, "Whoa! Wait a second, what's going on here?" And verse 8 holds a kind of a key to this. The first thing is that we read there that this vineyard owner, this landowner who goes to hire these people, has a foreman. Now, what's interesting about that is that if he's got a foreman, the people at the time would have said to themselves, what's he doing turning up at the street corners of a town or a city to pick up these workers? Why didn't he send his foreman? He could send somebody else. Why is he doing this dirty work and going to an increasingly agitated group of people 5 times through a day? Secondly, and a huge amount of this parable hinges on this particular detail. You'll see at verse 8, the second half of it, the landowner says to his foreman, he says, this is the end of the day, in the middle of verse 8, and he says, call the workers and pay them their wages. It is the end of the day, and you'll see at verse 2 that the landowner has made an agreement with the labourers that they'll work for the day and they'll be paid a denarius. Now, there's a little A that appears in some Bibles, and that gives us, those little letters give helpful notes or insight into what's going on in the text. And it tells us with that little A in the Bible that we use at church, that this denarius was a day's pay for a labourer. And actually, there was a phrase that went around with this, and it's a phrase that's used in verse 8, where the landowner says, pay them their wages. And actually, it was a phrase that was known as the wage. It was a shorthand way of saying, pay them the normal daily rate for a labourer who works on your land, give them a denarius. It was just known as the wage. It meant a denarius for a labourer for a day's work. We have phrases like this in our culture and our society and our language as well. Let me give you an example. Even at the moment, to do with the coronavirus, when people talk about coronavirus, they might talk about the COVID. Oh yeah, that neighbor of mine got the COVID. Not just the COVID, not just COVID, but the COVID. But actually that phrase, the COVID, can be used in a completely different way. You'll hear people talk about being on the COVID. What do they mean by that? Well, it doesn't mean that they're standing on the virus in some way, but to be on the COVID is a way of saying that you're receiving the unemployment payment from the government because you've lost your job or you've been laid off or furloughed due to the virus. Are you on the COVID? Are you receiving the COVID? It's a shorthand to say the money that the government gives to those who have to be paid because they've been laid off. It's the COVID. That's exactly in the same way that this phrase, the wage, was used in the time of Jesus. It was a shorthand way of saying a full day's pay for a labourer. And so when in verse 8 it says, when the landowner says to the foreman, he says, pay them their wages. Our English translations translate that in the plural wages. But in fact, the Greek text, which Greek is what Matthew wrote his gospel in, uses the phrase the wage. The landowner is saying to the foreman, pay all of the workers, no matter what time they started, whether the earliest ones or the latest ones, whether you started at 6 o'clock or 6 a.m. or 5 p.m., whether you worked the entire day or just 1 hour, pay them all the wage. Pay them all one full day's wages. Well, the scandal of this, if this were to happen, this is the drama at the heart of this. Jesus' listeners would have known exactly what was going on here. This landowner is paying the day's wages no matter how much work each of the laborers did. Why does Jesus tell this parable? What is this all about? Now, the parable is often called the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And I want to suggest to you, as somebody who writes about these things called Ken Bailey does, he writes brilliantly about this, that actually it would be better to understand this parable if we called it the parable of the compassionate landowner. You see, it hinges on this master who has this unusual behavior, who returns, he goes once and then he returns 4 times. And you're thinking to yourself, did he not know at the beginning of the day how many workers he would need? Why didn't he just bring them all in at the beginning of the day? Why does this landowner return like this? And all kinds of people have wondered about this and wondered why Jesus told a story about this landowner who does this. But I think the answer is very simple. And it basically boils down to compassion. That this is a compassionate landowner. And we should call this parable the parable of the compassionate landowner. You see, this landowner realizes the sense of dignity and humanity that comes with being able to find work. He takes the first group early in the morning, he gives them work to work on his land. And then maybe he returns out of a sense of compassion for these others who he'd seen but he hadn't taken, hoping that they're going to have found work. And he sees that he hasn't, so he brings them. So he brings them back to his land. He returns again and again and again and follows the same process, even at 5 p.m. with only 1 hour's daylight left for working. And he brings people onto his land. He has compassion for them. He wants them to have the dignity of purpose and the humanity that goes with working. Now, any of you who've been unemployed or have been underemployed, who can't find work, whether it's work in the home or work in study, or whether it's work in employment, but you can't find any of that kind of work, you know the pain and the dehumanizing effect that it has to not be able to work. It's debilitating and it's miserable. There's no joy in not being able to put yourself to some use, to take on your responsibilities. And as Jesus tells this parable, I hope that God shows you that God has such compassion for people who find themselves in that circumstance. God understands the pain of what that is. Jesus recognizes the suffering that not being able to find work causes. You'll notice at verse 4, the landowner says, you also go and work in my vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right. He's determined to do what's right. He's determined to bring justice to these workers. The relationship that Jesus describes is a relationship of justice between landowner and worker. The landowner gives dignity to all 5 sets of workers out of compassion. So he's motivated in one hand by giving dignity to people, but also in giving unjustified reward. You'll see what you might think is quite understandable, the reaction at verse 12 of those who've started early once they see that everybody who's come and worked much less than them in the day is paid the same amount as they were. They cry foul. What's the landlord up to? And they make a valid point that you could easily take to a trade union today, and I'm sure they get on board with you. Those who were last worked only 1 hour, they said. and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. We did the hardest work, the longest work. We did it at the worst time of the day. Equal pay for equal work, they cry. A perfectly reasonable viewpoint to have when you work in a workforce. It was reasonable then, it's reasonable now. But what we discover, and this is at the heart of this parable, is that this landowner doesn't operate in a normal way. He doesn't operate in the way of the world. He points out, verse 13, that everyone got what was agreed. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Did you not agree to work for the wage? How does the landlord explain what he's doing? All the workers, they happily agree to this. This landowner wants to be especially generous to other workers. He wants the last ones who are hired, those who only came and worked for an hour, to not only have the dignity of work, but also to be able to go home and have felt like that they've earned a day's pay, that they're going to be able to care for their family. It's generosity on top of justice. They're getting what they don't deserve. They're getting a gift of grace. They're being enriched by this landowner out of his compassion. This is a landowner who does what is right, but also adds grace on top of it. In his world, people get what they don't deserve. He uses his riches justly and he gives generously. Now, in all of these parables, we've got to ask ourselves, well, maybe we've got what it's about, but what does it mean and what does it mean for us? And we're told at the beginning by Jesus that this is a parable that tells us something about the kingdom of God. And we've said that what that means is that it tells us something about the nature of God and how he deals with people. And it's specifically in this parable got to do with who is rewarded and how when it comes to becoming part of God's family. As you read the Gospels and you make your way through them, you realize that a lot of the religious leaders who heard Jesus are scandalized by him. They're scandalized by what he says, but they're also scandalized by the kind of people he keeps company with. People they've said are sinners. These religious leaders consider themselves to be a religious elite. But Jesus is not that interested in them. In fact, he says that they tie people and they burden people, and they're a weight on people's souls by all their moral rules and regulations, and needing to be on their inside with them as the gatekeepers of what's right and wrong. Jesus has come to liberate people who are outsiders, come to give hope to those who are considered to be sinners. See, these religious people have managed to tidy their moral act up. They're people who have been able to put on the public show. The news Jesus consistently declares is that nobody is able to do it on their own. Everyone needs the compassion and grace of a rescuer. That you can't just tidy yourself up like these religious leaders say and expect. And this parable tells us a couple of key things about the nature of God. The first thing that we see is that he desperately wants to bring people in. This picture of the landowner returning again and again and again is a picture of God. The surprise, as I said to these listeners, can't be overstated. If you've got a foreman, he does the dirty work for you. But actually, this is a picture of God coming to the earth himself in the flesh. As Philippians 2, chapter 2, verse 6 says, speaking about Jesus, being in very nature God. So Jesus is the nature of God. He's God himself. But what does Jesus do? He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. This landowner comes and does the work of his foreman, of his servant. Jesus comes in compassion to do the work of a servant in order to bring dignity and humanity to people. This is a shocking and scandalous claim that's distinctive to Christianity, that God comes in the flesh. That he doesn't just send a prophet, that he doesn't send somebody else to do his work, but he comes to woo and rescue humanity in the person of Jesus. Something else that we learn in this passage is that the good news is that God gives you what you don't deserve. I mean, imagine those workers who've come, they've come for an hour's work, and who knows what they thought they might have been paid. When they're given a full day's wage, they worked 1 hour instead of 12. They've been paid 12 times more than what would have been right or just. And And Jesus says that this landowner explains within earshot of these workers that the landowner can do whatever he wants. He can choose to give his riches however he wants, and he chooses to give them to those who don't deserve it. And it's the upside down kingdom of God's grace. You can't earn his favor. You can't earn a place in his kingdom any more than these workers didn't earn the daily wage. You can't earn your place in God's kingdom. You don't work for it. You don't try and impress God with anything, with your religious act and your morality. All of us need the grace of God, and all of us rely and depend on this unjustified and undeserved grace and riches that he lavishes on those who trust in him. We see from what Jesus is saying here is that essentially the system is rigged. It's at the very end, at verse 16. Jesus used this phrase, a really famous phrase, and he says, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." That's what he's saying about the kingdom of God. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. This is the extraordinary, unique, upside-down news of the Christian message, that God turns the tables. He privileges the helpless. He gives riches to the undeserving. It's the opposite of how every other system of power works. It's the opposite of how every society operates. And you say, no, but we live in Ireland. We live in Ireland and it's just and fair and everybody has an equal chance, don't they? No, our society is just as rigged in favour of the first chosen, the insiders, those with a good start, as much as any other society. Let me take, for example, work, because that's what this parable is about. Have you got a good job? How do you think it is that you've come to have a good job and you can describe yourself as comfortable and have a decent income if you're in that situation? How is it that you've come about? And you might say, well, I've worked hard and I've got an education. Well, that may be true, but the reality is the odds are stacked massively in favour of certain people when it comes to income in Ireland. Those who have a third level degree in Ireland have on average 60% more income than those who don't. So those who've got a degree on average have a 60% better pay than those who don't. And you say, well, everybody fills in a CEO form, don't they? They can all go and get degrees. Well, no, you push the statistics a little bit further and you'll realise that those who are born into families where the parents, or at least one parent has one degree, are 3 times more likely to go to college and get a degree than those who aren't. So on average, those who happen by accident of birth to be born into a home where at least one person has a third level degree or qualification, that person has got a much better chance of having a better income when they go through life. We read all kinds of other statistics about things like this, about education and access to education. If you're born into a single parent family, your chances of getting suspended from school are more than twice that of a child from married or cohabiting parents. If you have the misfortune of being born female, you will on average earn 20 to 50% less than a man who is exactly the same level of education as you have. All of us, every bit of the system is rigged in some way. If you consider yourself comfortable, economically speaking, it's very likely that you've benefited from a system that gives comfort to the comfortable, that those who happen to be born in certain places have on average a benefit. And if you think about Ireland, and you think about even the people who are poorest in Ireland, if you compare us to the rest of the world, and by the accident of birth that we have by living in Ireland, compare that to living in a developing country, even the people who are the middle income earners and considered wealthy in those countries have nothing compared to even some of the worst off people in Ireland. And that's just about an accident of birth. The system is rigged for those who are born into the right places. The first stay first, and the last stay last. Except in the kingdom of God, where everyone is welcomed no matter what their birth story, where everyone is equally incapable of justifying themselves before God. This is the place where God lifts the lowly. This is the place where God gives riches to those who know their need of it. It's not that those who are rich aren't welcome in God's kingdom. It's not that if you got a good start, in some way, that that God won't respond to you trusting in him. But there is one key entry point to getting into the kingdom of God that those who are doing quite well might miss. And it's that we can't earn it ourselves. We can't justify ourselves to God. And listen, this is easy for Andy to say. I count myself within this group. I'm male. I'm white. Both of my parents have third level qualifications. 3 of my grandparents had third level qualifications as well. I have all of this privilege. But the reality is that we're all treated the same in God's eyes, and all of us need to realize that not our birthplace or our birthright isn't what's going to make it for us. It's acknowledging that we need the riches of the one who gives dignity to all. We need the lavish grace of the one who invites us to put our faith in him. This extraordinary, liberating, good news message of God's grace, of him welcoming you into his kingdom and calling you to follow him.